kill it. Let's kill it.
Thanks, Huck. Well, good morning, or I guess this is afternoon, or evening, one of those. And, it's funny, I was thinking about this. I took a bunch of notes on my life, and I just think it's crazy that you actually have to take notes on your life when you'd imagine that you'd be the expert of your own life. But, as I said, my name's Jeremy Mort. I'm the home group lead here at Home Church, and they asked me to give my testimony, and so here I am. I don't think I have that crazy of a testimony. I would say I lived an average life. But one of the things I've kind of realized is when I went through the return recently, and as many people have, one of the things I got from the return, it was this, during worship music, there was this piece that came on that talked about how God loves us 100%. And he loves us 100% all the time. And it kind of went on and on about this, and I really started to think about it. He said, it doesn't matter if you are you're here on a Tuesday or you're here on a Sunday. God loves you 100%. He loves you 100% if you aren't here. He loves you 100% if you're doing the wrong thing. He loves you 100% if you never step foot in a church, you never choose God, and you end up in a very dark place. He still loves you 100%. And it was trippy as I'm trying to think about this. I'm like, God really loves us 100% of the time? And I realize it has nothing to do with anything that we do. He loves us 100% because he is faithful. He said he would love us, and he does. And the reason I'm bringing this up at all is when I look at my life, in a given moment, when any of us are going through whatever, we don't necessarily think of, God loves me right now, because you're going through something, it's hard, and you don't really see it in the moment. But when you take time to look back at your life and see where you've been, what's happened, and everything that you went through to get you to where you are, and especially if you're a Christian and you realize God has been working his whole life and he's loved you all that time. And love could look like, warm hugs and kisses. Love can also look like discipline. And so he loves us 100%. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to tell you my story. And then after I tell you my story, I'm going to go back and I'm going to say, this was God. I couldn't see it the first time through, but this is where he was, and I can see it now. Okay, so I was born in 1981 to Christian parents, and my father was 45 years old when he had me, so he was pretty old. And, he had a previous marriage with 4 children, and my mother was 36. This was her first time she'd ever been married. And because I was the first for my mother, I had a really strong connection with her. I was the ideal mama's boy. I just loved my mother. And I really didn't understand the purpose of my father. And I remember actually a conversation I had with her when I was young saying, what's the purpose of him? He's just mean and he's grumpy. I don't understand. Like, why don't you just get a divorce and let's live with one another? Because I don't understand the purpose of my father. And that was just kind of the relationship I had growing up. And but the lucky thing I had, both were Christians. My father was actually an elder at the Presbyterian Church, and my mother actually grew up Baptist, and she went to a completely different church, but they were both very dedicated to the Lord. And because of that, when I was 8 years old, I was baptized, and a few years later, in the Philippines, in my uncle's church, I actually was baptized there. So, normal childhood thus far until I got to about 10 years old. I actually had a dream about my mother dying of cancer. And when I was 11, she got cancer, she got sick, and she died. And that was really hard on me. I didn't know what to do. Some of the memories from that is when it was towards the end of her life, she knew that she wasn't going to make it, and we went to the Philippines, and she was going there for natural treatments, but it really ended up she was just saying goodbye. And I remember leaving her at the airport. She was trying to come in so we could hang out for a little bit. It didn't work out, and my last memory of her is giving her a hug outside the airport in the street before never seeing her again. It was really difficult, and a few months later, my father and I, we were walking along in a park, in a state park, and all of a sudden, I got really tired. I couldn't walk anymore, and I looked at him, and he got really tired, and we just sat down. I looked at him, and I said, "Do you think it's Mom?" I found out a few days later, that was the exact moment she died, on the other side of the planet, but we knew. Luckily, my father and I, because we only had one another, we started forming a relationship, and it grew from there. And he had a plan with my mom. It's like, hey, we were going to build a house, and they had already bought the 30 acres and everything else, so just the two of us, we built a house. And now I have that as part of my history, and we actually live in that house today. It's actually really cool. When normal childhood, got to 18, I started working at Subway, and I wish Melinda was here because she'd know exactly what I'm talking about. And because I worked at her Subway, and that's where I met Leslie. Leslie and I started going to college together because my dad said he'd pay for it if I maintained my grades. I didn't maintain my grades, and I realized that my life wasn't going to be what I wanted it to be unless I made some changes, and I needed something to temper my will because I wasn't wild, but I just didn't want to do anything that I needed to do. And so I talked to Leslie and looked at the military, and I joined the Marine Corps. I was active duty for 8 years in the Marine Corps, and at this time, I was deployed to Iraq once, Afghanistan a couple times, about 2 years in combat zones. And during this time, we got married after my first deployment because she was around long enough. I'm like, oh, well, we'll probably stick it out at this point in time, so let's get hitched. After Afghanistan, my first time to Afghanistan, Ben was born soon after, and then after my second deployment, Gavin came along. And I met some of my closest friends in the military. Dave, Matt, Chris, Shane, these are all people that have had major impacts in my life, and many in Christian ways. It was also around, probably shortly after I was 18 until probably mid-2010, 12, 13, somewhere in there, that I was actively walking away from Christianity. I was captured by some of the world's ideas on, is there really a truth in there, and I started to buy into some of those lies. And about early 2000s, 2010-ish, 11, 12, I decided I'd sacrificed enough for everyone else. And I wanted to be happy. I wanted to do something different. I wasn't really investing in my marriage, and I'm like, I want to figure out what can make me happy. And I started living for myself, selfishly. That was an utter disaster. It happened for about 2 years. I tore my life apart. I tore my marriage apart. I wasn't faithful. And I'm not the type of person that does anything halfway. I go all the way, even if it's a bad thing. I'm just all in. And honestly, it's a miracle that we're still married today. It was because of my wife's faithfulness. She got a hold of the verse saying that, if I follow God, I can start to change the heart of my husband. And that's the reason that I started to change. And as we were trying to figure out how to live with one another and make a life together still, luckily, I've never taken anything more seriously in my life than my kids. When I talked about the beginning, when I think about God loves us 100% all the time, that's what a parent should be doing for their child. They should love their child 100% at all times. Now, it doesn't always mean, again, loving warm kisses. It could be discipline as well. But I've taken very seriously raising my boys because they didn't have a choice about being in this world. I brought them into this world. We made a decision, and I needed to take that seriously. And so my kids, and the fact that they were starting to get into Christianity and church, I'm like, I really need to figure out how I stand on Christianity. And so I took a deep dive into my life, figured out what I wanted to believe, and I decided God was it. I needed to start living for God, and I needed to raise my kids the best way I could because they earned that. They're my children. I deserve to give them the best. And so I did. We started getting into church. Leslie was heavily involved with the church in Okinawa. At this point in time in my life, we had moved to Japan. I lived in Japan for about 10 years. And she got heavily involved in church. I started getting involved in the church, and our lives just started turning around. When we started walking out our Christian faith, every aspect of life started getting better, every one. And, here in 2021, because of COVID, you couldn't move around. Japan was 10 times worse than it is here, and we couldn't visit friends and family, so we decided to move back. And now we live in the house that we built. We attend the church that we were married in. We have never been better in our whole life, and despite all the pain. And, God's been so good to us. So that's my story in a nutshell. How was God with me the whole time? Going back to my childhood when my mother died, God used the suffering I went through to my benefit. He had a plan. And that's the thing that was crazy for me. I can't tell you how hard that was for me to bear as a child. I was never really angry at God, but I was hurt. And my father was not a present father. He'd done this before. He was going to leave that to my mother. But thankfully, he was responsible. He said, I owe it to you to give you my presence. And he made a choice to invest into me. And I needed a parent. I needed my father. I needed him. And it was one of the most important relationships of my life. I needed him to be who he was. He taught me tenacity. He taught me how to work. He taught me how to deal with my quirky personality and how to deal with how we thought. He showed me what it was to be a father or a person that pursued God. And, as I think about this and I look back at it, I don't know if anything less drastic than the removal of my mother from the situation would have caused us to change. He had no intent to change to be the father he needed to be, and I didn't want to have anything to do with him. And as I look back at my life, if I had an option to change it now, to snap my fingers and say, my mother's alive again, I wouldn't choose it anymore. And that's a hard thing to say about my own mother. But the truth is, I wouldn't be the man I am today. I wouldn't be the person I am if I didn't have that relationship with my father. And I don't think there's any other way that would have happened. Neither one of us would have chosen that. And so God used the suffering, the hardship in my life. He had a plan, and he used that plan to make me who I am today. And I want God's plan. I don't want my plan. And so as hard as that is, I still choose it, even if I could have chosen something else. Another area, I mentioned Chris, a really good military friend of mine. He showed me the benefit of growing up in a Christian home. I never really thought about it. We met in the military under pretty dubious circumstances, and it's certainly not something I should repeat here. But we got together, we started hanging out, and I realized immediately, you and I can be friends. And I started to pursue him as a friend. I'm like, we're going to be friends. And we built a strong friendship. He got out of the military, moved to Utah, and we kept in touch. And as we talked about life, one of the things I realized, he grew up with a crazy background. He was in foster care. He did all this stuff, drugs, everything you can possibly imagine. And of course, he got old enough, he found a wife that matched his energy. And if you've never grown up in an environment that's healthy, then it's hard to create a healthy environment going forward. And they didn't necessarily do that with their kids. And so his life was a mess. And he's working on it, and it's getting better, but it's still a mess, and he's still working through it. But he would start calling me and saying, hey, how do you handle this situation? Or we'd talk about something. He's like, oh, yeah, this is what I would do. And he's like, oh, yeah, that's right. Yeah, that's what I'm going to do. I'm like, okay, cool. And move on. Over the next year, he'd call me, we'd talk, and he'd ask me about this and that. And I'd tell him, what I would do, how I would handle the situation. And then one day he asked me, he's like, how do you always seem to know how to handle these situations? Like, what makes you different? How did you figure out what to do in all these situations? And all of a sudden I realized I had won the lottery with my parents. They grew up as Christians. They raised me as a Christian. And despite the fact that I went off my own way and was trying to do my own thing, I had a foundation in Christianity. I had all of these different things that had helped set my path. And when he was asking me about him, I was just telling him how I lived life, how I grew up. And as we started to getting back into church and started reinforcing those principles and seeing my life get better, I was able to start investing into him. And I was able to witness to him. And it was amazing. He's now a Christian. He's still a Sunday Christian, but he's working on his way to get better. As far as another one that we had is marital hardships. As I said, I tore our family apart. I kind of like to think of marriage as a house that you're building together. I didn't wreck the house; I wrecked the block, and it was really hard, and it wasn't good. And one of the things I learned throughout all this situation is I was looking to get filled by the world. I was looking to get filled by my wife. And I had a hole inside of me that needed something. And I kept trying to figure out what could fit in this hole. And when we hit all these lows, one of the things I realized, the hole I was trying to fill, no human can fill. No person can fill that hole. I needed God to fill that hole. And in the shatters of the life that I had destroyed, I started to look at what could I do to fix this? What did I need? And eventually, of course, as Leslie started setting the example for me, I started to look to God. And everything started making sense. And I guess one of the greatest things about that particular part of my story, and that's a long one that I don't have enough time for, but God has really shown me that I need Him, and His path that He has for us is the best way that we can live a human life. Every time I choose what He wants me to do, whether it's tithing, whether it's treating other people the way you want to be treated, whether it's how should I treat my wife, how should I raise my children, every time I find myself aligning with God, I found my life becoming better. And a lot of these things don't make sense. It's the idea of sowing and reaping, and if I give away, I'm not going to have as much. How am I going to do this? And you find out the things that you're giving away, you don't actually need. Those are earthly things. And I found as I've sank into this life and finally surrendered, and that's really what this was. This is a story of surrender, that my life has gotten better and better. And I'm just so grateful for that, for the fact that my wife set the example and allowed me to grow. She gave me the patience. And now the story that we have, the hurt that we've been through, it's only God that he can actually turn that around, and now we can use our own story to start helping other people. And we've helped a lot of other people at this point in time with, how have we gotten through this? How have we gotten to a place of healing? How have we gotten to a place where we can grow and start to minister? It's God. And so I can't thank him enough for showing me how much I need him, and then showing me the path, and then walking with me day in and day out. I could go on and on about different areas of my life that God, I can go back and say, this is where God is, this is where God is, this is where God is. But the thing I want to say in conclusion is that God has been with me my whole life. You know, and I couldn't see it at the beginning. I had to look back and see it. And there's a couple of things that it requires. The first thing it requires is that you need to know God and God's will and God's character. And we all do that by the Bible. You start reading the Bible, you can start to see where God's character is and his fingerprints. So when he's touching your life, when he's involved in your life, if you know the Bible, you can start to see where he's the one doing these different behaviors. It could be a simple coincidence where you're like, two things lined up, and you're like, oh, this is you. And so first you need to know his will. Secondly, you need to slow down enough to reflect. You need to take time and look back at your life. He did command us to rest. If you know God's will, his fingerprint, and how he acts in your life, and you slow down enough to actually look at your life, to see where he's been working, to see how he's been doing different things in your life, there's no way that you wouldn't be convinced that God has loved you. He's always loved you. He loves you 100% before, he loves you 100% now. You just have to take the time to see it. Thank you.